At the heart of the debate over Syria is upholding international norms and conventions, and whether the United States will continue to act as the world's policeman, enforcing those norms, sometimes single-handedly. Polls show that most Americans clearly oppose the idea, which is a major change from the recent past. Not long ago, Henry Kissinger was a leading cop on the world beat, forging relationships with America's most implacable foes, the Soviet Union and Communist China. First as National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Kissinger was a dominant force in U.S. foreign policy. And his words still carry weight with the world's policymakers. And I sat down with him earlier today to ask him about this critical moment for America's place in the world. Dr. Kissinger, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Do you think President Assad is directly challenging President Obama? And what should President Obama do?
No, I don't think that President Assad is aiming at challenging President Obama. President Assad has engaged in a repugnant act, but it is not aimed at President Obama. It's aimed at his domestic opponents. What should President Obama do? Let me answer in two parts. I have been against American military intervention and have said so publicly in the Syrian civil war. And I continue to be opposed to military intervention in the civil war. This, however, is a use of weapons of mass destruction, which has consequences beyond Syria. And it is necessary to oppose them before we institutionalize the use of weapons of mass destruction, not just in Syria, but elsewhere. And for that reason, and for the limited purpose of penalizing the use of weapons of mass destruction, I support President Obama's request, and I've urged Congress, insofar as I can, to support it.
Right now, Congress, the votes are not there. By all intents and purposes, if President Obama was to seek the vote today, he would lose. What has President Obama done by devolving executive authority to Congress? What does this do for America's place in the world and the power of the presidency?
I'm deeply worried about that aspect of it, because it creates the impression, say in negotiations with Iran, in the case of other challenges, that the president really doesn't have the authority to act unless he asks Congress, and that therefore there's a substantial delay while the Congress deliberates, and then while the Congress is tempted to bargain about the tactical execution of military operations. I thought this was the sort of act well within the powers of the president. Under the War Powers Act, the president has 90 days to notify Congress before, when he engages in much larger operations than we're talking about here. We're talking about one strike, or a limited strike. So I think was unwise to put it before the Congress, but it would also be dangerous for the world if the President of the United States were repudiated on a matter that he considers of the importance of the campaign he has now put forward.
He obviously does not want to do this. He is not somebody who wants to go to war. He said it himself publicly. He is the president who was elected to stop and end wars. He also, I was amazed to hear him say from St. Petersburg, I cannot tell the Congress or the American people that this is an imminent threat to America's national security, the use of chemical weapons. Do you believe that it is or it isn't?
No, I don't believe it is an imminent threat in the sense that they will be used against us. But the spread and the use of weapons of mass destruction is going to be, and it's one of the fundamental problems of our time. And if it gets legitimized in any way, we may see it then on a scale with all the conflicts that exist around the world, and the ease of manufacturing these weapons. That is the issue, but it's not imminent tomorrow.
The world is an anarchic place. And without treaties and norms and conventions, you know, who knows what would happen? The Americans, for decades, have been the world's policemen. People don't like it here. They say, why should we? It's a thankless and a hopeless task. Does America need to be the world's policeman?
No, we can't be the world's policeman. But we can be the world's last resort. It would have been a lot better if this had had a formal vote at the UN, even it had a formal vote in NATO, and it would have been much better, as in Kosovo, if we had had some grouping behind us. But in the last resort, and if the issue is important enough, the United States may have to act really for the sake of everybody.
Mm-hmm. You were in office during the Cold War, when there was a major existential threat to the United States from the Soviet Union. And yet, your administration and thereafter managed a period of détente and some sort of constructive relationship with Russia, with the Soviet Union.
Right.
Today, that does not seem to exist. The level of poison between the United States and President Putin is at an all-time high. What's gone wrong and what should happen? Can that relationship be reined back in?
I think we have got the relationship involved. We have not managed to separate in this relationship our view of the domestic situation in Russia from our view of the foreign policy. And there has been an attempt, and I believe, either that you couldn't deal with Putin or that it would be better to replace Putin or to encourage replacing Putin with somebody else, so that the foreign policy issues have been overwhelmed by these domestic policy issues. Putin is a man who wants to restore Russia to some respect, but he comes from a country that has a tradition of flexing its muscles. So sometimes the conduct is confrontational. But in the end, we in Russia can develop common objectives, because where we clash are issues like Syria, where I believe we both should have the same objective, which is the radicalization of the Arab world. Because a radical Arab world will spill over into Russia before it spills over into us.
Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much indeed for joining me.